Hello and welcome back. This is the week 10 lecture. So as promised, we're keeping the reading load somewhat light this week. I would imagine some of us might still be catching up on some of our recent readings. I know we've been moving pretty quickly, so if you're still finishing up Hope Leslie, that's okay. If you're still finishing up some of the stuff from last week, the Poe, the Hawthorne, Irving, that's okay. Because really all we're looking at here in week 10 are just a few excerpts. We're not actually reading the entirety of any work this week. We're just looking at a few chapters. We're going to check out some of Lydia Maria Child's letters from New York, just to get a feel for some popular literature of the time period. So I mentioned the American Renaissance last week, and we are in that unit now. We are in the midst of Unit 3, which really is focused on that so-called American Renaissance group of writers. And I've already mentioned a lot of these names. We've already read a couple. Usually Hawthorne is included. Poe would sort of be included later, not initially, but he would get added a little bit later, along with Melville, who we're going to read next week. Whitman, who we're also going to read. Emerson, we'll see a little bit from him. And sometimes, some other figures from that period like Thoreau might get added in, but that's sort of the core group: Hawthorne, Poe, Melville, Whitman, and often Emerson. They're all writing at roughly the same time. They're publishing a lot of their really important works in the late 1840s and into the 1850s. So this guy F.O. Matheson, who was an American lit scholar, really helped to sort of generate what we now think of as the American literary canon. Part of that group I've sort of mentioned of kind of World War II era scholars who basically sat down and kind of figured out what were the most important works in American literature up to that point. And this was kind of an important historical development because that was really the time at which American literature became a true academic discipline. The study of literature, of course, has been around for a long time, but as you might imagine, in earlier periods, most college students in this country, when they took literature classes, they would have been learning about European literature. They would have been reading older national literatures, older works. It really wasn't until the early to mid 20th century that, it was viewed, American lit was viewed as extensive enough, rich enough, substantive enough to really be an academic field of its own. So Matheson's kind of an interesting figure. I included a little bit about him in the week 10 overview, just to give you guys a little bit more historical context about how the American Renaissance came to be defined, how that era and that group of writers came to really be understood, and also to kind of help us understand why it is that even to this day, in a 19th century American lit class or any older American lit class, you have to read a lot of these figures. Hawthorne has been anthologized and taught for a long time. Poe and Whitman and Melville, they've all been these sort of pillars of American literary history, and Matheson and his contemporaries are a big reason why. They sort of created that template, established them as really important writers, and future generations of scholars kind of followed suit. But what I also wanted us to understand about that process, that sort of creation of the American literary canon, is that there were a lot of stuff, a lot of texts that were excluded for various reasons, and reasons that we often find to be pretty inadequate today. So if we're talking about Matheson and that whole process, we have to sort of also realize that he and his contemporaries intentionally, it was very much deliberate, they excluded a lot of the truly popular texts of the 19th century. And as I've mentioned before, many of those popular texts were classified as sentimental novels, and many of them were written by women. So now, from our modern day perspective, we're pretty confident in asserting that Matheson and his fellow male scholars, because they were all male, they were all white, and they were all men, they basically made the decision that the most important American writers were also white and male, and they intentionally excluded more popular writers, and they sort of justified that, at least when it came to sentimental novels, by sort of mentioning that they were, you know, feminine, or they were geared towards a female audience, which devalued them in the eyes of Matheson and his colleagues. So there was a great deal of misogyny involved in the creation of the canon, and we can sort of, you know, that's not hard to understand when you think about the time period and the sort of cultural norms that these guys were working with. But we've tried to rectify some of their mistakes, some of their poor decision making. We have tried to expand the canon in more recent decades to involve a more diverse group of American writers, but also to sort of paint a better picture of what was popular amongst audiences, right? Because again, I mentioned a little bit of this last week when we got into Hawthorne. You know, what made Hawthorne and Melville and Poe really significant to Matheson and his colleagues was this idea that, you know, those writers were really dealing with weighty, substantial issues. They were wrestling with what it meant to be an American. They were wrestling with a lot of these really big ideas, sort of central concepts to our sort of national character, our national history. They were wrestling with that stuff. And again, Matheson and others would sort of explain away their lack of popularity, and in part, I think this is true. They would point out that, you know, those guys were a little bit ahead of their time. They were doing some formal experimentation, or, you know, trying on different genre formulations that maybe a lot of readers weren't ready for, or maybe a lot of readers weren't ready to reckon with these big ideas that the likes of Melville and Poe and Hawthorne were sort of wrestling with. Again, that was very much Matheson's view. And then, in contrast, they looked at a lot of the popular sentimental novels of the 19th century and viewed them as less substantive. They viewed them as not so much engaged with these big ideas and these larger sort of national or cultural concerns. Now, from our current perch, we can see, again, just how wrong they were and how they were really overlooking a lot of what was sort of going on in those sentimental novels. It's likely that they themselves did not read a lot of the sentimental novels, but they also dismissed them in large part because those books at that time, and for a long time, were viewed as being sort of strictly the province of women. Dealing with domestic issues, dealing with plots and characters that, again, many male scholars viewed as just less interesting or less important because a lot of it centered around home life or family life. A lot of it revolved around relationships, interpersonal dynamics, and they just sort of decided that that was less important, generally speaking. But now, of course, we have a more nuanced, more complete understanding of the sentimental novel genre, but also we're less inclined to reject that stuff strictly because they reflected a sort of feminine or women-centric world. So there's been a lot of sort of revising of the canon, and we're starting to really feature a lot of these sentimental novels more prominently. We're recognizing that we need to read some of these. We need to know a little bit more about the genre, about some of these authors, and also some of these individual texts, because not only were they popular back then, but they're really, in terms of style and content, they're not far removed from a lot of popular, culture or entertainment that continues to be prominent today. So some people will argue that sentimental novels are almost like the forerunner of modern soap operas or like melodramas that we can still see maybe in TV or even in movies. There's other ways to think about the lineage, but, stories centered around domestic life, women characters, and a lot of the concerns and daily struggles that women would have encountered back then. Now we see the historical value, the literary value, the overall aesthetic value, and just the entertainment value of those kinds of stories. We appreciate them a lot more than Matheson and his crew did roughly 80 to 90 years ago. So just be aware of that. We're not... I don't expect you guys to be experts, and we're not going to, write or be tested on Matheson or these scholars that helped create the concept of the American Renaissance. But to understand what the Renaissance was, we also have to understand what got left out and what got excluded. And we need to understand that even though the likes of Melville and Hawthorne and Whitman were really prized and championed after their death, none of them were nearly as popular during their careers, during their lifetimes, as the sentimental writers that they often sort of disdained. So I mentioned that famous quote attributed to Hawthorne last week when we were talking about him, when he comments on the, hold on, let me find it. I think it's the damned mob. Yeah, the damned mob of scribbling women. And he doesn't mention in that, I think that was a letter that he wrote where he has that line. And he doesn't mention many writers by name, but one that he does mention by name in that letter is Maria Cummins. So she's one of the authors that we're looking at this week. She wrote The Lamplighter, which came out in 1854. Very popular, successful novel, and a great example of the kind of sentimental genre that we're talking about. I've linked you guys to all of our texts this week, but again, the full text is available, but I'm not expecting you guys to read these entire novels. They are quite long, but The Lamplighter is one of the 4 novels that we can just sort of sample a little bit. You can just check out the first few chapters. You can, feel free to read as much as you really have time for. I don't have a really strict sense of reading assignments this week. I just want you guys to check some of these out. I would like you to read the first 4 of Child's Letters from New York. If you could get through the first 4, they're not terribly long. But for the novels, just knock out a chapter or 2 for each one. And if you're interested, if one of them sparks greater interest, you can read on if you have the time. But I just want you guys to get a sense of the style, the plots, the subject matter, and just how these novels sort of function. But as I've said before, we talked about sentimental novels way back in, week 5, I guess, when we read The Coquette. So I've already sort of defined the genre broadly and talked about that particular subgenre of sentimental novel known as the seduction tale. So that's really what The Coquette was an example of. And I also mentioned another very popular early American novel, Charlotte Temple, which operated in a very similar mode. It was also a seduction tale written by Susanna Rowson, who's a pretty important author of the very end of the 1700s, early 1800s. As I've mentioned, she was born in England, but spent much of her adult life in the U.S. So we know a little bit about seduction tales and maybe about sentimental novels more broadly, but as I mentioned when we were talking about The Coquette, it's just worth remembering that the first best-selling novel in the U.S. was Charlotte Temple, written by Rowson, very much a seduction tale, very similar plot to what we saw in The Coquette. That was a bestseller for decades, not just a few years. It was the best-selling work of fiction in America for decades. Like, the only book that consistently outsold it was, like, the Bible, in a lot of cases. So, and people still had lots of Bibles back then. So it was a wildly successful book for a long time, and it was finally eclipsed by another sentimental novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, another one of the novels I've linked you to this week. That comes out in 1852, I believe, and it sort of supplants Charlotte Temple as the most popular, work of fiction produced in this country. Just in terms of sales, just in terms of what people were buying and reading and talking about. So, interesting to note that both of the top best-selling works of fiction in American literary history prior to the Civil War were both sentimental novels written by women, and they were both sort of dismissed largely by those scholars who helped to create the American literary canon. For a long time, Uncle Tom's Cabin was regarded as an important sort of historical footnote, because you guys might know I think it's apocryphal, but there's that famous quote attributed to Lincoln, apparently when he met Stowe, he made some comment to the effect of, "Oh, you're the lady who, started the Civil War," or, helped to start the Civil War. I don't know if he actually ever said that, but for a long time, the novel was viewed as a real sort of a bit of a turning point in terms of the sort of abolitionist movement, which had been well underway long before the book came out, but it was such an explosive sort of treatment of slavery and the inhuman, inhuman, whatever conditions both work still found in the South at that time, that it was often viewed as a book that helped to really spur more public opinion against the institution of slavery and made a lot more people sort of aware of the injustices and the crimes against humanity that were taking place. So it was often viewed as sort of historically important, but not a great read and not really a great work of literature. But if nothing else, it was sort of remembered for its historical role. A lot of the other popular sentimental novels of that general time period, though, for a long time were kind of forgotten. But like I said, now many of them are coming back. But I just wanted to give you guys a couple of definitions for the sentimental novel genre, because it's a very broad genre. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very different book in terms of style and subject matter than The Coquette. It's not a seduction tale in the same way. I mean, there is some elements of that, but that's not the primary focus, right? So what we notice when we talk about this genre is it's very expansive, it's very broad, and it's not specific to a particular type of plot. There can be a lot of different plots within the sentimental genre. Again, we saw that subgenre of the seduction tale, but that's not how all sentimental novels function. So the genre isn't so much defined by plots or even characters. It's really more defined on a sort of emotional register, which is interesting to think about. And there's lots of reasons for that, but I just want to read you a couple of definitions that we largely still use today. So I found these on a couple of, like literary encyclopedia websites. So here's one. Broadly speaking, a sentimental novel is any novel that taps into the reader's capacity for tenderness, compassion, or sympathy, often to a disproportionate degree. So there's one definition that's still operative. And just to think about, what does it even mean to be sentimental? Like, we hear that word still. It's not used as much today, but we might still be kind of familiar with the word and what it means. But in case you're not sure, to be sentimental is to be susceptible to feelings of tenderness, sadness, and or nostalgia. So these are kind of interesting ideas to think about. So I don't know about you guys, but I sometimes feel like the idea of being sentimental or being overly sentimental, sentimentality is often given kind of a bad rap in modern day, in our sort of modern society. Maybe that's changing. But at least like in my youth, and I think for a long time, as we started to kind of prize irony and, sort of ironic detachment a little bit more, I think a lot of readers and viewers were sort of taught to resist sentimentality, right? And I think we have more modern ways of kind of capturing the same idea. Like we might call it hokey now, or, overly emotional or melodramatic. Sometimes it might strike us as unrealistic or just sort of too much too engaged in emotions. We're almost taught in some ways to not really trust that, or to view it as kind of, again, sort of aesthetically inferior, if that's the sort of valence that it's operating on. So, again, I don't know if you guys agree. Maybe you've had sort of different experiences with the word, but I think if you notice the way sentimentality still gets used, or how that descriptor still get used, oh, you're just being sentimental, you're too sentimental, right? It still kind of carries a little bit of a negative connotation in some cases. And again, that's a little bit of a vestige, sort of a leftover sort of thing from the way these novels were often thought of and talked about and written about, at least, in an earlier era of scholarship. So, as I told you guys before, they became very popular in England during the 1700s, sort of at the dawn of the novel in the English language. And again, they were really recognized from the beginning as having a kind of unique emotional power and a sort of ability to affect readers on a sort of profound level in a way that other works of literature did not. So those early sentimental novels, particularly coming out of England, were very much marketed as having this sort of this instructional quality, this like moral instruction that was sort of built in. And we talked about this with the Coquette and a little bit with Charlotte Temple as well, mostly with Charlotte Temple because it's more overt in that book, which is part of the reason it doesn't age as well. But the way Ralston explicitly frames the novel in her like introduction is it's a lesson. It's a lesson for young girls so they can avoid the mistakes that Charlotte, the protagonist in the story, falls victim to. So it was explicitly presented that way as moral instruction, mostly for young women, so they would understand the right man to pick as a husband and how to avoid seduction and how to avoid social ruin and having your reputation ruined, like basically what happens to Eliza in the Coquette. But also there was supposed to be this connection between reading the books and virtue. And again, this was very much pushed by the authors themselves, this idea that if you read these kinds of books, you will be more inclined to feel sympathy, not just for the characters in the book, but obviously them, but also you'll have a greater capacity for sympathy just in daily life. You'll have a greater compassion for others. You'll care more about the suffering of unfortunate people in your own society or in your own town. So there was a real practical value that was getting attached to these novels. They weren't just, it's entertainment, it's fun. In fact, fun wasn't maybe always the primary goal. It was a little bit of scared straight tactics. Don't let this happen to you. But it was also this idea that by reading books that really tapped into our emotions and really sort of compelled us to feel sympathy or compassion for others, that doing that would just make us better people. It would just make us more caring. It would make us better able to relate to other people who didn't share our background or our experiences. But by reading these kinds of books, we would be better equipped to feel strongly for others. Even if we didn't know them personally or we weren't close to them, we would still have compassion. We would care. And as an extension of that, we would be able to maybe reform some of the worst aspects of society. So that was all kind of baked into the formula. So again, the plots would vary widely. But generally, not always, but generally the protagonist would be a young woman, often coming of age, sort of entering adulthood. And as we saw with the Coquette, a big part of that was marriage, finding a husband, trying to find a sort of comfortable domestic situation. So if any of y'all have read, Jane Austen, she's dealing with a lot of those subject matters as well. And some people would even classify Jane Austen as a sentimental novelist, sort of working in a similar vein. Domestic concerns, female characters, a real emphasis on relationships, primarily heterosexual relationships, choosing between different suitors, a lot of the stuff that we saw in The Coquette. I think what differentiates Austen from a lot of less remembered sentimental novelists would probably be her wit, her sense of humor, her knack for social satire, the fact that she was sometimes poking fun at the very conventions and the domesticity that sort of reigned supreme in her novels. A little bit more of that than what you might have found in Rowson or, Hannah Webster Foster. But again, somewhat similar in terms of characters and plots. But again, they didn't always have to revolve around relationships. And they didn't always have to be sort of light and somewhat comic like a lot of Austen's novels were. So for example, Uncle Tom's Cabin has a much wider cast. It's much more about sort of current social ills and sort of recommending, again, reform. The idea of social reform was very important in most sentimental novels. Not necessarily all, but it was characteristic of the genre. But in some cases, the young woman protagonist might not have been looking for a husband. She might have been trying to overcome other hurdles. Like in The Lamplighter, it's more like sort of socioeconomic struggles and, trying to overcome a sort of disadvantageous, disadvantaged social position. So sometimes it was more in that vein. Sometimes it did revolve more around relationships. Sometimes the main character might have already been married, and it would have been more about her domestic life, her home life, managing the kids, managing her husband, dealing with all the other things that fell under her purview. So wide-ranging subject matter, but again, usually female protagonists and usually this sort of emotional sort of resonance that people would pick up on and sort of talk about. So that's a rather broad way to think about a genre, but again, it was often sort of put aside as overly feminized or overly emotional. So again, that was partly why it was rejected, why the genre was rejected by Matheson and company, in the early 1900s. But now we're recognizing that not only was there a lot more going on beneath the surface, but of course, those domestic concerns, those female characters are often very interesting in their own right. But it is important to remember the practical function, because like we were saying with The Coquette, a lot of these novels were being published in a time when we're still early in the history of the English language novel. And remember, there was a lot of suspicion and some distrust of fiction and novels in particular in the 1700s and the early 1800s. A lot of clergymen and sort of, moral authorities thought that, reading fiction, reading novels was bad for young people. It would corrupt young people, or it would, take their attention away from more important pursuits. So part of the way that these early sentimental novelists navigated that was to say, oh, well, if you read my novel, you're going to learn some moral values. You're going to become a better person. You're going to have a deeper well of sympathy and just general care for your fellow humans. So that's very much part of it, and that would remain part of it, really, throughout the 1800s. That would remain a big part of a lot of these sentimental works. So let's get into some of the examples that we're looking at this week. So first, Lydia Maria Child and her letters from New York. So Child's a very interesting figure. I've mentioned her a little bit as sort of a contemporary of Sedgwick. She really does belong to the Renaissance generation, more or less. I mean, she's born around the same time as some of those other guys, but her career is much longer. She begins writing in the 1820s, and she continues writing really well into the late 1800s. She lives a rather long time, and she wrote a lot of stuff. So fiction was just one of the many types of writing that she did. She also was an early sort of pioneering journalist. She wrote children's literature. She wrote nonfiction. Like I said, she was like a newspaper reporter and a columnist. So she wrote lots of nonfiction articles and essays. She was a bit of a literary critic and scholar. She wrote what we often regard now as kind of early examples of, like sort of critical or scholarly writing on literature and on culture. So she was quite versatile. She wrote some religious texts as well, and she was very much a social reformer. She was an abolitionist, and she was also a champion of Native American rights. So just to kind of give you a brief bio, we won't get too far into it, but she did write a really important novel quite early in her career in the 1820s called Hobomok. And I mentioned this when we were talking about Hope Leslie. So they came out roughly, within like 2 years of each other, and they had a lot of similarities. So they're often taught together and talked about together because they were both examples of that frontier romance genre that we talked about weeks ago. Historical fiction, action set on the frontier, conflict between settlers and Native Americans. But like Sedgwick, Child tended to present more sort of more positive, more humanized portraits of her Native American characters compared to a writer like James Fenimore Cooper, another very popular writer of frontier romances who often villainized his Native characters, made them very one-dimensional, much like Brown did also in Edgar Huntley. But in Hobomok, Child earned a good bit of criticism by depicting an interracial relationship between a Native American man and a white woman. Now, not to give too much away, you guys might want to read the novel, but the relationship ultimately sort of fails, both because of like societal pressures and problems within their own relationship. But ultimately, I wouldn't say it's the most positive portrait of a sort of interracial union, but just by depicting it at all, just by showing a possibility of it, and by showing that, these two people could be attracted to each other, they could sort of regard each other as equals, they could have a relationship sort of based on equality and mutual affection and respect. That alone, even though it kind of turned sour later, just presenting the possibility of that was pretty groundbreaking for the time period. So we saw in Hope Leslie that for a moment, it almost feels like Sedgwick wants us to think that maybe Magawiska and Everell could end up together. But very quickly, we realize, no, they're just friends. So crossing racial boundaries for friendship is possible in Sedgwick's world, but not romantically, not in a more intimate way. And even Child seems to ultimately stop short of a full endorsement, but again, raising the possibility and really creating a pretty sympathetic portrait of multiple Native American characters in that book. So much like Sedgwick, she's writing a frontier romance, but even there's elements of the sentimental novel as well. She's definitely tapping into our emotions, wanting us to feel sympathy, wanting us to feel, in some cases, bad for individual characters, but it wasn't it wasn't feeling bad just for the sake of feeling bad. It was you feel bad for them, and in the process, you recognize that there's bigger problems at play, right? Where we want to get to a solution. Like we see a problem, we see characters suffering, and we want to then maybe do something about it. So that's what I mean when there's this social reform function kind of implied in a lot of these types of books. It's, readers are supposed to be compelled to have sympathy, but also act on that sympathy. Maybe do something, file a petition, get in touch with your local representative, try to change a law, try to do something to help a disadvantaged group, which in that novel at least was, a Native American population in New England. which is where Child was from. Like Sedgwick, she was a New Englander. She was from Boston. So she's drawing on some of that same New England history that Sedgwick was also utilizing in Hope Leslie. But again, I would say Child was much more vocal and much more forward-facing as a social reformer, as somebody who championed Native American rights and was a very vocal and very active abolitionist. Things that Sedgwick wasn't quite. So she was a champion of women's rights, Child was, the abolition of slavery, and Native American rights. She became the editor of an abolitionist newspaper called the National Anti-Slavery Standard. I believe the letters that she wrote that were later collected as letters from New York were published originally in that paper that she also helped to edit. So she's important on a literature level, but she's also important if we were to ever do more with the history of newspapers and journalism in this country. I've already mentioned the kind of parallel growth of newspapers and novels. They're not the same, right? But they sort of became popular and widespread at roughly the same time in this country. So like I mentioned, with those early sentimental novels that were often sort of ripped from the headlines, scandals that really happened, and then writers like Foster would change the names, fictionalize a few details, and basically retell those stories in novel form. So we've already seen this kind of close relationship between realistic novels, often sentimental novels, and newspapers. So Child works in both mediums. So she's a newspaper reporter and also an editor. She edited and wrote for several different periodicals. And again, she's publishing all kinds of different writing. But she also helps to kind of pioneer the modern notion of a newspaper column. And Letters from New York is a great example. So she's writing to an unnamed correspondent. So you notice she's using this kind of epistolary structure and style. These are supposed to be letters, right? Letters that she is writing to somebody. And she's using this kind of second person address, which is interesting. Again, it's like she's addressing another person. That person just remains unnamed. And this is a newspaper column. These were recurring, this was like a recurring feature. And she would have a new letter like on a weekly basis or monthly basis, whatever. And we, I know people don't really read newspapers anymore, but if you do, if you go and look at the way newspapers are still structured and were for a long time, there's normally columnists. And the columnist is a little bit different than just your typical rank and file reporter. They're often a long-serving reporter who's kind of moved up in the hierarchy after a long time. But what you'll notice with Child's letters is she's not exactly breaking like hard news, right? It's not like, that kind of journalism. It's not like current, stuff that's happening, like big events, big newsworthy events that we are breaking and bringing you live or right after they happen. That's not really what the letters are about. Instead, she's reflecting on life in New York. She does pick out some specific scenes, some specific moments or events, but she's not really interested in reporting doing that kind of, hard reporting. It's more about reflections on the city in general, life in the city, the effects it has on people, things that she sees, things that she experiences, and often these individual moments or scenes will kind of prompt further reflection. We might view these sometimes as digressions, as she kind of wanders into sort of larger, pondering or considerations. So these are often thought of as very reflective, almost kind of stream of consciousness letters. And the subject matter varies widely. She sees a lot of different things. But again, for her, tangible moments of city life are often opportunities to really muse about more abstract things or more complex truths that those moments or scenes help to kind of exemplify or illustrate. So there's a good example of this if you look near the end of the first letter. This should be on page 3 in the reader that I've linked you to. She's looking out, she's on the battery, like, on the seashores, essentially looking out, looking at the boats and the water. And she uses her observations about these old, like, masted ships, these old, sailing ships. And she's contrasting them with the modern steamboat, which moves much faster and is sort of more efficient, but perhaps not as aesthetically pleasing as the old sailing ships. And it just kind of gets her launched into a larger consideration about modernity, the rapid change in America. And it's not dissimilar to what we kind of got with Irving in Sleepy Hollow. Before he really gets into the story, he wants to kind of give us a sense that American society is changing very rapidly. But here in Sleepy Hollow, we have a place that has largely stayed the same. So just kind of using the fictional, or in this case, non-fictional, setup to create a sort of avenue or a platform for more philosophical musings and digressions. So she does that quite a lot, and then she kind of wanders off and talks about street musicians and why she enjoys them. But the idea here is that a lot of these city scenes, if analyzed and thought about the right way, would sort of reveal larger truths. And what's kind of important also for her is that a lot of these experiences, a lot of what she is recreating and talking about in these letters is very much, very akin, very similar to what you would find in sentimental novels, right? She is talking about the powerful effects of what was often called back then right feeling, or how right feelings will prompt right action. So again, this idea that if we read about people maybe struggling or suffering, or just people that are very different from us, right? People that might be encountering problems or injustices, or maybe their lives are just very different, but we read about them, we learn about them, we become more knowledgeable about them, and in the process, we just sort of become better, more caring people. And if you think about that line or that logic, it often still gets used. It's not unique to sentimental novels anymore. That's often the sort of logic used to justify reading fiction, period, is that it makes you more sympathetic. It makes you more capable of relating to other people who are different from you. It helps you to learn things, but also it gives you what they called right feeling. Those feelings of sympathy, compassion, and care, both for fictional characters and, by extension, the real people who they often represented or stood in for. So that's at work in these letters as well. Again, she's shining light on some real social problems. And she's hoping that by reading about them, by better understanding them, readers might want to do something to bring about reform. So throughout the 19th century, a lot of sentimental literature was often associated with Christianity and various reform movements, like temperance, trying to get people to drink less and, to be more sober-minded, abolitionists, often sort of, utilized a lot of these strategies and a lot of these literary modes. So all of these different kind of social causes, these different reform movements, whether it was trying to abolish slavery, trying to fight for equal rights for women or Native Americans, or sort of combating other things that were viewed as vices like drinking and gambling. A lot of that was best expressed through sentimental literature, or what we're seeing here, which is almost more like editorializing. It's more like a newspaper column, not fiction, but still written in a similar sentimental style. and again, I think we still have a lot of literature like this, and I think we still have movies and TV shows that do this. We just don't use the same terminology, and we don't necessarily think about those texts in the same way, but we can detect a lot of this work still getting done in similar ways. It certainly hasn't totally gone out of fashion. But yeah, Child does kind of view New York as a den of inequity. That's not the only impression that comes across, but she definitely does feel that way. She thinks that society, not just in New York, but again, she's writing these letters in the 1840s, like 1843, 1845, and she's very much sort of reflecting on the ways that the big city can sort of chew people up. And, that whole scene in the 5 Points neighborhood, when she's talking about these people who are very poor and, struggling, suffering. There's high rates of crime. There's high rates of poverty. She wants us to know, and she wants us to ultimately do something about that. But she's very interested in these sort of trials and tribulations of life in the metropolis. And again, we still talk about that. We still talk about some of the challenges that can come with living in a, densely populated urban environment. You can sometimes become isolated. You can sort of lose yourself. You can fall into, at least according to her, you can fall into, crime or other sort of vice-like activities. So she's really interested in spiritual and moral growth, and this belief that it's possible in a city. It's possible, but it takes a little bit more. It takes more of a concerted effort. And she also just believed that in order to be a good person, in order to achieve spiritual and moral growth, you couldn't do it exclusively in seclusion. So she was very much a believer that in order to be a social reformer, in order to bring about positive change, you had to sort of surround yourself with regular people. You had to be out there. You had to be in the world. You had to be an active participant in your social surroundings. And by doing so, and she's very much doing this by walking through the city, by doing that, you open yourself up to sympathy and other emotions. So she herself was a sentimental novelist, but we can see how a lot of these tactics, a lot of these methods would show up in other types of writing, not just novels. So I think that's mostly what I wanted to talk about with Child, but again, sort of wanting us to see the city and the people living in the city through the lens of sympathy. And what does that mean? I mean, we can still ask ourselves, what effects does that have on an audience? How do we feel? And are we prompted to right action? Are we prompted to try to do something about some of the social ills that are being portrayed? Of course, these were social ills of a long time ago, but we might decide that some of them are still with us in different forms. And again, maybe we can find contemporary literature, stuff that's popular right now, that might be somewhat sentimental in terms of its style, its message, and this, emphasis on emotions and right feeling. So just a quick gloss on the novels that I've also included. So I mentioned The Lamplighter by Maria Cummins. That comes out in 1854. You can check that one out. And then we also have, what else did I put in there? Oh yeah. So we have a popular novel from Eden Southworth. Another popular sentimental novelist of the 1800s. She continued to write well past the Civil War. She was publishing, like Child, more into the late 19th century. Eden was a pseudonym. It was actually her initials. Oh, well, it was, she was taking the initials from her real name to create sort of her pen name. So her actual full name was, I'm going to make sure I get this right, Emma Dorothy Eliza Nivette. So Eden, for short. And she wrote a bunch of popular sentimental novels. I'm just linking you to one. I believe it was one of her early works Retribution, or The Veil of Shadows, a very provocative title. It was originally published serially in 1849, but the version that I've linked you to was the book-length version that was not collected and published until 1860. So another linkage between these early sentimental novels and newspapers is the fact, and I've mentioned this, I think, before, a lot of sentimental novels and other early novels in the States and also in England would be published serially in newspapers, meaning installments would appear, once a week or daily or monthly for a certain period of time, and that's how a lot of readers would first encounter the text. And then later, they would often be collected into a more traditional book form and be published that way. But originally, Retribution was published serially in periodicals in 1849. But again, she wrote, Southworth continued to write for a long time. We also have, let's see, I have one from Fanny Fern, who was a newspaper writer, who then transitioned to becoming a novelist. Actually, I think Fern and Southworth both wrote for periodicals, but I might be getting them confused. The novel from Fern is Ruth Hall, which was published in 1855. And then, as I've mentioned, I've also linked you to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which came out in 1852. So we can see they're all being published around the same, time period, same general era, and they're all prime examples of sentimental novels. So again, just read as much as you can, get a feel for each one, and that's really all I ask for this week. The text that I would like you to focus the most on is Child. The only author that we're looking at this week who will appear later on the final exam will be Child. I'm not going to test you on any of the other authors because we're just not reading enough of them. I just wanted to give you a sampler, but Child will at least pop up a little bit on the final. So try to get through her first 4 letters. And it's just interesting to think a little bit about the geography and just the changing culture and nature of the city. I believe it's letter 3 or letter 4 when she's in Hoboken, which is a city in New Jersey right across the river from New York, a very densely populated urban area today. But she's describing it as this sort of natural, idyllic, sort of, Eden-like setting where Native Americans can still be, located. And she's talking to some people, and a far cry from what it is now, but just a reminder that during this time period, America was rapidly urbanizing. So New York in the 1840s wasn't nearly as big as we think of New York as being now, but it was a metropolis by our standards. We didn't have the kinds of, our cities weren't as big as European cities yet, but Philadelphia, Boston, New York, they were growing rapidly, and they were growing outward. So places like Norwalk and Hoboken that had previously been really rural, they had been located, near cities, but they had retained this very rural agrarian character. That's really starting to change as we get up to around the middle of the 19th century. And a lot of those areas, which we might now think of as like suburbs of the big city, they were rapidly modernizing, urbanizing, and that was changing their character. That was displacing the Native Americans that were still there, of course, but this is post-1830, so many of them had already been forcibly relocated. But it was also just changing the way of life, changing the way people interacted, changing people's relationships with the city, changing the kind of work that people did, changing the way people lived, their living conditions, what they ate, right? It was a big period of rapid change, and that's true over many decades. So again, we hear Irving talking about that in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which was published about 25 years before Child, is also kind of reflecting on it a little bit less directly in her letters. So just that's another backdrop that we should be aware of, this rapid change that's going on throughout these decades. Okay, so the final thing I wanted to leave you with, I'm going to try to link you to this article if I can in the Week 10 module, but just another great way to think about sentimental novels and to think about the power that they had and the real social work that they did, throughout the 19th century. So Jane Tompkins is a really well-known American lit scholar, and she's written quite a bit about sentimental novels and the work they did. And she makes this it was somewhat controversial like in the 70s or 80s when she first made it. I think now most people tend to agree, but she claimed that, I'm trying to get her wording right, the power of women's emotions as sort of delivered through these texts was often a more effective critique than the works of Melville or Hawthorne or any of those other figures from the American Renaissance. So that's what I wanted to kind of leave you guys with today, is Tompkins' argument, and I'm really simplifying it, but if you want to read the whole thing, I'll try to find this article, or it might have actually been an intro to a longer work, but I'll find what I can. But basically what she's saying is, later the Renaissance figures were prioritized in part because they were sort of morally ambiguous. They were interested in psychological darkness, like we talked about with Poe and Hawthorne last week. And again, there was this idea that they were wrestling with big, weighty concepts that were really critical to America, but they were doing it in a sort of opaque way. And again, it was perceived by Matheson and others to be high art because it was a bit ambiguous and it could be interpreted slightly different ways, and it was challenging and often difficult to penetrate and fully understand. But what's interesting about all that, it's not wrong, but those qualities turned a lot of people off to Melville and Hawthorne during their careers. Like when Melville published Moby Dick, people hated it. People didn't understand what it was supposed to be. They didn't really understand what he was going for. The emphasis on metaphysics, this sort of exploration of darkness at the core of humans. That's interesting stuff. A lot of people like works that explore that stuff, but there was a lot of ambiguity. There was a lot of sort of indirect delivery of their message, which could often be lost on audiences. So that's kind of the point that Tompkins is making. She's saying, the reason the Renaissance figures were prioritized was because they were ambiguous and kind of hard to nail down, but those very qualities made them less popular during their time, made them less relevant to the readers of their time, because a lot of the readers didn't really know what was going on or how to take it. So we can appreciate their work now. We can appreciate how modern a lot of it is, how it kind of anticipates developments in modernism and postmodernism, and that's all well and good. But Tompkins is saying if we want to appreciate what really made a difference back then, what really affected audiences back then, and might have compelled or motivated those right feelings and those right actions, it was the sentimental novels. It wasn't the metaphysical meditations of Melville and Hawthorne. It was the sentimental novels of Fanny Fern and Stowe and Southworth and those types of writers. That's what had more of a direct impact because it was more accessible, it's more popular, often a little bit easier to read, easier to understand, and those were some of the reasons why Matheson and company devalued it. Oh, it's too simple. Oh, it's too feminine. Oh, it's too sentimental. But now we don't necessarily view those things as negatives in the same way. And also, I would just add, the books are not quite as simple as Matheson and them claim they were, but there is more of a directness right? There's more of an open-heartedness, again, sort of wearing the emotions on their sleeves, being very clear that they want the reader to feel certain emotions. Whereas Melville or Hawthorne, they're not going to quite tell you how they want you to feel or how you should approach this character or this situation. So again, in the 20th century in particular, we really came to prize ironic detachment, skepticism, cynicism, and I would argue a certain amount of ambiguity in our art. A lot of that became sort of hallmarks of good art, and I like a lot of that stuff too. But Tompkins explains how that sort of logic was used to devalue the sentimental novels of the 19th century, and she claims that what Matheson and his ilk didn't realize is that more direct, that more emotional approach actually got through, and it actually affected readers on a profound level, and it actually prompted change, real social change, real social reform in a way that Melville and Hawthorne never could. So I'll leave you with that, and it might become more and more worth returning to as we start reading more of these American Renaissance authors. We'll see Melville next week. You'll see what I mean about him being a bit ambiguous and hard to understand. So now we have that point of comparison where we can come back to these sentimental works and compare them to these Renaissance figures and their texts that we're going to be spending most of Unit 3 looking at. All right, so I think that's enough for today. Let me know if you're having any trouble with the links that I've provided in the Week 10 module, and I will see you next week when we get moving on Melville. Oh yeah, I did just want to mention, I forgot to mention this with Child. You might not have heard of her. You might not be familiar with any of her other works, but she is still remembered today as the author of a poem that you probably do know. It's called Over the River and Through the Woods. I used to hear it when I was a kid. I never knew where it came from. I never knew who wrote it, but Child wrote it in 1844, and it was published in one of her works of children's literature. So I'll just recite the first stanza to you guys. You probably heard it. I only remembered the first stanza. I didn't realize how much longer the song was. Over the river and through the woods, to grandfather's house we go. The horse knows the way to carry the sleigh through the white and drifted snow. So you probably heard that, at least the first few lines. That's a Thanksgiving poem. It's about the Thanksgiving holiday and going to spend it with family. We still say it. My mom will still recite the first two lines of that poem. I think we've all forgotten the rest of it, but I'll still hear those two lines, over the river and through the wood, to grandfather's house we go. That's Child. So if you've ever heard that, Child lives on even before this class. Okay, so I'll see you next week and we'll get started on Melville.